Hey, Kelsey.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell everyone what's happening in today's episode?
Today, we are going to talk about the most taboo subject of all.
Yes. Okay, let's get into this.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsey Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
Episode 37. Taboo equals menstruation.
Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm.
First thing we have to do is we need to acknowledge how taboo this topic is. And
Taboo for who?
Taboo for who, I think, is a bigger question. But I'm sure there are some listeners out there that are rolling their eyes like...
I know, we already lost 6 people.
Yeah, they heard the title of this episode or saw it, and they said, nope, not for me.
No, keep your Crimson Tide to yourself.
Yeah. And to those people, I say, I hear ya. Well, because I think there are a lot of people that are... who would be allies, happy to support women's rights and all of those things, but are like, God, do you have to talk about bodily fluids and bathroom visits and that type of thing?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do.
It's part of our lives, and the fact that we have to hide it or feel shame is a real problem for me. But I do think that the universe exists right now, that there is definitely a population of people that don't enjoy talking about menstruation and are also really uncomfortable by it. I think there's a handful of men I've met in my lifetime that are comfortable talking about periods. One of them is my husband, but it's because he's a sex ed teacher.
Yeah.
The other, had a lot of sisters, and so just was like, yeah, my house is a shit show.
Yeah. And I think that there probably are some women out there, though, too, that are, like, uncomfortable talking about it.
Oh my gosh, I
well.
still have friends that hide their tampons in their sleeve when they go to the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
And to them I say, everyone's level of comfort is different. And there probably are women listening to this podcast that maybe do that, so I don't want to alienate them. But I guess I get the stigma, and I hope that the generations behind us are not going to be as burdened by those things.
Yeah. And while I agree, I think that it is taboo and it should not be a burden. It should not be a stigma. It should not be something that girls worry about. It shouldn't be something that when you go to the grocery store, you are embarrassed when you have a male cashier who's checking out your tampons or whatever. But at the same time, I think to give some recognition and honesty, there really are, you wouldn't publicly talk about bowel movements, or you wouldn't talk, people, there are things that happen in bathrooms that are taboo, that are not taboo because of sexism. You just don't talk about that stuff. And
because it's more inappropriate for conversation.
Yeah, it's inappropriate for conversation. And so for some reason, talking about menstruation has become a feminist issue, but in their eyes, they see it as basically the same thing, that you're talking about these things that happen in the bathroom, etc. And so to those people, I think what they need to understand is what we're going to get into in this episode, which is the history of that stigma and just how stigmatized menstruation was, to the extent where women are completely ostracized from their normal life during that time period of their life. And, or in that portion of, every month. And,
I mean, if you work it out, it's 12 weeks a year.
Yeah, right.
It's less than maternity leave.
Yeah. And I feel like if you can acknowledge that it makes people uncomfortable, then it might make it easier for people to understand where you're coming from. That like, okay, we're not going to talk about it in a way that is just like blood everywhere, you know, like that just
Can we though? That sounds fun. Like a murder scene.
But and I understand that. And there are, but if you think about it this way, like if you cut your arm and you were bleeding, you wouldn't have any problem being like, guys, I'm bleeding. Like, could somebody please give me a bandage? In fact, like if you didn't help in that situation, like you're the jerk, you know?
But also to not call attention to it, you're also crazy.
Right.
Like, guys, my arm is bleeding.
Right. No, it's not. I'm fine.
You're like, look away, shame. Can you slowly hand me a bandage
and
under the table?
Of course, the obvious difference is that if you cut your arm and it's bleeding a lot, like that's probably an emergency. Whereas if you're menstruating, it's not an emergency. Like you're fine. You just need to go clean up.
When you first get your period and don't know that because no one talks about those things, a lot of girls
they think they're dying.
Are terrified and think they're dying.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So there certainly is a difference, but you still need support. You, especially young girls, need to know that like it's okay. You're not dying. Also, like, you know, I think there's a weird line where some girls treat this as like, yay, I'm a woman now. And then other girls like me are, that happened to me for the first time, I was mortified. I was like, oh my God, my life, what is happening? I'm a woman now. Oh, you know? And like.
Your mom didn't make a moon celebration for it?
Vito, did yours?
No, thankfully. But she definitely didn't make me feel shame about it either.
Good. That's good.
Yeah, no, but I, you know, talking to girlfriends about this scenario, a lot of people have different experiences. And I always kind of felt bad. I grew up with a good friend of mine, and her mom was not in her life. And so it was her dad, and having to talk about menstruation with her father was incredibly uncomfortable. Yeah. And, but it also, I think, helps her now as a parent realize that, like, there's going to be things that her own children are not going to want to speak with her about. And it's nice to have some diversity of people to support your children. Yeah. So that if they're uncomfortable talking to you, then they can go to someone else.
Totally. And as a teacher, I always want to be that person that any kid can feel like they can come in and be like, so my period, you know, just great. Like that's awesome. That's why I'm here. And I do want to just take a quick moment to just acknowledge that, like, not all women have periods. And that's totally fine. And it doesn't make you less of a woman or anything. And, but I think the reality is that the stigmatization around menstruation impacts anybody who presents as female.
Yep.
And so all of the stereotypes and stigma that you know, women who menstruate, or people who menstruate, we shouldn't even say women, really, deal with is coming from all of this history that we're about to get into related to menstruation. And the title of this episode is Taboo Is Menstruation. And the reason for that is the word taboo actually is Polynesian, and it comes from the Polynesian term tapu, which means sacred. And it also means menstrual flow.
Interesting.
So the word taboo is literally the original, or menstruation is literally the original taboo.
Weird.
Right? Just so fascinating that it
stems back that far to the origin of the word.
Yeah. My father-in-law used the term taboo this weekend, and I was like, just so everybody knows, that means menstrual flow. He just said it. Glad we're all on the same page.
You must be a firecracker at dinner parties.
No, my family just rolls their eyes at me.
Great, Kelsey's here. I wonder what we'll learn about today.
Oh my God, I was playing a game.
Hopefully tampons.
I was playing a game with my sister, and I gave her a clue, and the clue was Crusades, and she was like, I don't know that.
You're like, but I do.
But I do, and it would be awesome if you did too, because we'd win this game.
Turns out, could you be smarter about this? Thank you. Oh my gosh. That's awesome.
Yeah, she's amazing. Anyway, so let's get into talking about menstruation.
Yeah,
and the history there.
Give me the original woman who menstruated.
I don't know if we go
Who
there.
was the first to publish it?
Homo sapien. Right now, okay. So, from the earliest records that we have back to like 3000 BC to like 5th century BC, we know that people treated menstruation. And so the way we know that is just from artifacts that remain, right? Or records that are
find the
recorded.
original pad.
So, no, the original tampon, the ancient Greeks actually made tampons out of softened papyrus.
What's a papyrus?
You know, like the papyrus scrolls that the Egyptians would write on.
Don't say you know. Like, now I feel like your sister. I don't know.
I don't know, Kelsey. Okay. I feel like this was kind of foundational in learning about the Greeks, where they created some of the first paper, and it's this papyrus paper.
Okay.
And so it's funny because we teach, at least, maybe we don't remember, about papyrus, but then to also know that same technology is being used to help women treat menstruation.
It's a lot of labor. Isn't that really hard to make?
It is, and yet it's worth sacrificing, what did you say, 12 weeks out of the year.
That's what it equates to.
Yeah, although actually we should acknowledge that women in those eras that were fertile would not have menstruated as frequently as women do today, because they would have been pregnant or breastfeeding much more frequently.
Well, that or in crisis too, and like stress on the body.
Yep.
Like if you're moving or migrant, you're probably not menstruating.
Well, by 3000 BC, they're not migrant anymore. These are settled peoples in fertile crescents around the world. But you're right, their life is definitely more stressful in terms of like food insecurities and, like raids and war and like, their life is definitely hard.
Well, they have to use papyrus.
Because papyrus is your greatest technology.
This is going to be my reasoning for everything now. Well, because papyrus.
Because of papyrus, we are here. They also think, and this is true through other centuries, that they used sea sponges. And this is actually like... What?
I'm sorry. I'm like a 12-year-old in this whole episode. Sea sponges?
Yeah, sponges from the ocean.
Okay.
Right? Like, it's like a thing that floats around. I don't know.
Was that an old form of birth control, sponges?
Yes. Yeah, they'd use it like a douche. Yeah.
The worst. This is
the word douche is the worst.
It's hard for me.
Oh, okay.
It makes me giggle.
Okay.
I'll hold back.
You along with our listeners. So, from the 5th century to about the 15th century, we have women using basically early makeshift pads. And I would, this would be something that would be, it's not mass-produced pads like what we have today. This would be like cloth or, something that they are able to like pull together from everyday household items that they have. And it might be something that like your mother teaches you about and you learn from her how to do it or whatever. But it's all like within the home and it's makeshift. Also keep in mind though that like your clothing that you wear is probably like made by the women in your household.
Yeah.
So that's not like it makes sense that women would just like solve this problem on their own and like resolve it.
But they also keep track of each other's cycles too.
Yeah.
Like, that was a big thing that other women would help each other with. Like, it's been a full moon since your last bleeding, you might be pregnant.
Right.
And it's like, oh,
cool.
really?
I'm really glad that you know that about me.
Yeah. Because being single and not married. This is a problem.
This is problematic. Yeah. So it's also during this time, the 5th to the 15th century is what we call like the Middle Ages in history. And in Europe in particular, this is kind of like a dark period. Rome has collapsed.
I'm sorry. It's very dark.
It's very dark. Not literally dark, but it's dark
This is
in
when heavy
terms
bleeding
of
happens.
intellectualism. Well, and actually, when I teach world history, I have my kids debate that, how dark this period actually was.
Okay.
Because
what do you give them as...
there's evidence that there are growing universities throughout Europe. There's growing different forms of art that are popping up. The church is. We already talked on a previous episode about nunneries and all this scholarship it's religious scholarship, but it's still scholarship. And there's some really interesting ideas and philosophies that come out of those religious scholars. So there is a lot there that I would argue is foundational to the later Renaissance and Protestant Reformation and all of that. So I think it's worth a debate with your students looking at some of that evidence. But in this, we'll use the Dark Ages just as or Middle Ages just as like a reference point in time. During this time, historians sort of point to, and it's hard to know prior to that time just because people, again, it's taboo. People don't talk about menstruation. So it's not like pressing in all of the male historians' records. And also, this is how women are dealing with this stuff. Because, first of all, they're not thinking about that. Second of all, they don't know how they're dealing with it because women aren't going to tell them how they're dealing with it.
I know. Do you think that this is still the age where men really don't understand contraception and, childbirth, of how that all comes together?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely know how it works, but there are definitely misperceptions about, specifically things like DNA, about, which person determines the gender of the baby. There are lots of things that are still not really known. So what's really hard about looking at what is written about menstruation is just how much hostile misogyny is written in about women related to menstruation. Ugh. And so here's a quote. It all, and the thing is, it all has to do with blood. So here's a quote from this time period. A woman in her courses, the female body made her not simply less than human, but worse than animal. Of all human substances, blood is the most highly charged with power and danger. See the dietary prohibitions against eating blood in force from Jews to Sioux to Hindus. Menstruation is mysterious blood, dangerous, unclean, and threatening. And it goes on, it says, a menstruous woman is the work of Yuhurman the devil. A woman in her courses is not to graze upon sacred fire, sit in water, behold the sun, or hold conversation with a man.
I can't. Who comes up with this stuff?
She cannot behold the sun. She can't even see the sun when she's menstruating.
Just hide away in your hobby hole.
Yes. Yep. One of the things about it, too, is there's this theme, and you hear it at the end of that quote, hold conversation with a man. Somehow her dirtiness will get you if you're around her while she's menstruating.
I wish men were still afraid of us when we were menstruating.
You do?
Maybe not to that extent, but I don't even know. That's so crazy.
In Papua New Guinea, when a girl began to menstruate, they put her in a hut for a whole week, and they deprived her there of food.
What?
And they thought that because of hormones or something, they thought that women were dangerous to themselves. And so so they, they do these things to try to protect women from the devil in them or something like that.
Interesting.
And
I guess putting them in a solo hut is one way to do it.
It is, so in 1565, hang on, sorry, let me find this. Okay. In 1565, in Leviticus, there's, no wait, that can't be right. Sacred Law Book. Okay. In Judaism, there's a a law book that's written in 1565. And in that book, it says that women in this unclean state were forbidden to sleep in the same bed as her husband, eat with her family at mealtimes, occupy the same room as anyone else, light the Sabbath candles, enter the synagogue, touch her husband, or even pass him anything.
What? That's how much they thought that there was evil inside of her?
Yeah.
In those
She was not allowed
moments?
to occupy the same room as anyone else.
Oh my gosh. I guess if you reverse this, it's like, yes, I'll take some solo time by myself in a comfortable bed.
You could certainly turn it into empowerment.
Yeah,
but
like a positive, I guess. But it's really traumatic to just shun somebody that harshly.
Yeah.
And to, basically say something that is not their fault is their fault.
Yeah.
And treat them as such.
Yeah.
That's brutal.
We talked in a previous episode on Islam about how Muhammad was actually pretty revolutionary in ending infanticide and advancing women's rights in some small ways and, big ways for that region. And one of the things that's really cool about him is that in his lifetime, he tried to just address this issue facing women. And so his wife, Khadijah, he actually would let her come in and sit with him and their followers during her period. So, like, she was allowed to be in the room with not just not just her husband or any man, but like the leader of this faith. She was allowed to be in the room with him. And he would receive his prayer mat from her hand. So, in Judaism, they're talking about how you can't, even pass anything to your husband. And here Muhammad's like, I will take that from you, Khadijah. Thank you, And I just think that is really cool. And there's this quote where he drank from the same cup as her. And he said, your menstruation is not in your hand. It is not in your cup. And I thought that was really cool. Like, I'm not afraid of your menstruation getting me because it's happening,
all the time
in your lady parts. It's not happening out here. Right?
Yeah.
Which I think that's really cool.
Interesting. How very progressive.
It's interesting because it's this huge sort of challenge to other things that people think and feel about women during that time period. So, Brooke, we have set it up to the Middle Ages, and I'm sure there are people listening that are like, cool, so in the Middle Ages, it was problematic. You know what else was problematic? Bloodletting,
Leeches.
Leeches. So to those people, I say, just wait.
I know. Let's where are we at? How do we move along here where does this stay?
Well, I think we should take a short break. And we'll be right back.
Okay, fine. Go get a tampon.
For lesson plan ideas and how to teach women's history, go to our website, www.remedialherstory.com. You can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook. If you think what we're doing is needed, please consider joining our Patreon community. Through Patreon, you can sponsor a podcast with a small donation. Patrons get access to behind-the-scenes information, gear, and bonus episodes. But more importantly, patrons are putting their money where their mouth is and making a financial commitment to getting women's history into the K-12 curriculum. We are so grateful to our patrons who sponsored this episode. Our Herstory makers, Jeffrey, our Herstory heroes, Brooke and Barbara, our Herstorians, Jamie and Kent, and our allies, Nicole, Mark, Sarah, Leah. Thank you. You guys make this show possible. Okay, Brooke.
Everyone got your tampons in? Let's finish this thing.
Let's do it. Tampons. Sponsor this episode. No, I'm just kidding.
Tampax, cotton, the cup. Can we list all the things?
Sure. So, Brooke, we've been talking about the history of menstruation. And We talked about how the word taboo is, and menstruation is literally like the original taboo.
Same.
And the word period, which we use most often today to describe this, is not introduced really until the 1820s. 1822 is its first.
Who originated this?
I don't know that information.
Oh.
But it's used in the English language to describe, your courses or whatever. this
Every time
devil
you say
time.
your courses, I just think of like a southerner. Oh, she's having the vapors.
She's having the vapors. So in the 1850s, we see some other like at-home remedies where women are pinning cotton and flannel into their bloomers. We see a sanitary apron being invented and a rubber apron with a strip that runs between the legs to prevent blood from getting into a woman's skirts and seats. And this is great, but a lot of times it's still like
Sounds horrible. Cool. Rubber aprons. Got it.
Rubber aprons, yes. But a lot of times these are still like at-home remedies. And so,
Right. It's whatever you have access to.
Fascinating because like they're inventing a cotton gin, right? But like not something that will treat like everyday stuff. And I feel like this is a huge pattern in women's history where it's like because women don't sit at the seat that's designing stuff, they're not architects, they're not in these positions to...
Well, imagine the person that even invented the two things that you mentioned. It probably was a real feat.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we're going to make this thing for women, and it's for their periods. And then but we're not going to tell them about it. We're just going to slowly start to hand it out to a couple people.
Yeah.
It's like, keep it quiet.
Exactly.
Like, what? Can you imagine some guy walking into his factory? Today's the day people were making pads.
We're going to do it.
It's for the women.
Yeah.
And then here.
What's really interesting, flashing back a little bit to the colonial era, is that women in that time period didn't wear underpants. And I think about...
So they were just free balling, free bleeding?
Well, I don't know. And so they know that later settlers used rags, and we see here in the 1850s that they're sort of furnishing some interesting situations down there.
I love how they invented the corset to keep their waist slim prior to inventing pads.
Yeah.
Something they could actually use.
Right.
By all means, lift my breasts, but do not clean my blood. What?
What is happening? So what's fascinating about this is in early American history, we've got lots of diaries, we've got manuals from midwives, and none of them mention this type of stuff, which is interesting. And so that, I think, just adds a layer to how taboo this subject is.
Like
that
women even aren't even talking to each other.
Yeah, it really is so... What do you do?
It's like they don't know it happens every month. They're like, maybe it'll go away.
Maybe.
If we just stop talking about it, maybe it just won't happen anymore.
Yeah, this author, Gail Collins, in America's Woman, talks about how child molestation is mentioned more frequently than this in women's diaries. Hannah Clark and a friend were stopped in the street by an Oliver Warner who asked them, "When will the moon change?" And this was a hint that he knew they were having their periods, which is really interesting. And he said, "I believe you have circles round your eyes. I believe it runs." Their minister, the famous Jonathan Edwards, decided in his this sort of behavior was the result of young men reading midwifery books for titillation and launched into a campaign against the practice.
Oh, cool. Let's just get rid of those things that are helpful to women.
Yeah, and helpful to men, to even though this boy
women.
is clearly joking with these girls on the street, at the same time, okay, cool, so he understands something's going on in their life. That's awesome. So what's interesting about this is we have this record going on, but we also have an example of a preacher sort of using this as a reason for men not to know about this stuff. And like further, this is that same, very separate spheres, further dividing the genders. And again, she talks here about how because colonial women were pregnant so frequently, and had such terrible diets, they probably didn't actually have a lot of menstruation and bleeding, which is really interesting.
So free bleeding wasn't really a thing.
Yeah, or it was probably like very rare, very like not very rare, but like less frequent. So it was sort of like, oh shoot, okay, this is happening. Temporary situation. Let's figure that out. Yeah, find a sock. Sure.
I don't know. Just like let it run down your leg into your shoe. What's the plan, Susan?
Susan. Why is it Susan? What did she do to you?
I don't know. She's just not Karen.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah, we need to throw another name under the bus. In 1896, the first commercially available pad hits the market.
Oh, who invented that?
This was from Lister's Towels. And
smart men. They just didn't want to ruin their towels anymore.
Exactly. But here's the crazy thing. Because of the social stigma and taboo, this business venture fails completely. And they go bankrupt because women wouldn't buy it. Because, I mean, think about it. This is still and keep in mind, this is only like just over 100 years ago today. And women will not buy it because they don't want to be seen buying it. They don't, it's like, it's so taboo. It's so uncomfortable that they won't even purchase this product that would be probably really great for them. So in 1919, we see more, in the Middle Ages, we see some of that sort of like religious dogma about the devil and like being inside these women, need to ostracize them, blah, blah, blah. In 1919, a professor published an article that basically claimed that there was something called menotoxins in women's menstrual blood. And these menotoxins are basically like poison. And so he's publishing this scientific article in a journal that's being read by other scientists. And that's as recently as 1919. So it's crazy when you think about that because it's taking some of this like outdated bloodletting ideas. Like bloodletting is this, the reason they bloodlet people, George Washington was bloodlet, is to let out some of the virus. Like the virus or the whatever. And obviously it's pseudoscience, it's not real, it wouldn't really work, probably kill you. But the same
did.
those same fears that people had about blood and the reason they would let it out through bloodletting, they took those same philosophies and they applied them to women's menstrual flow. So it's toxic, it's poisonous, it's, whatever. And so he's taking these like very outdated and pseudoscientific theories and he's applying it in a recent scholarly article and he's inventing a word called menotoxins, which is just gross. And I don't know, like it's fascinating that was allowed.
Sounds like fake science.
Yeah. World War I nurses invent a modern pad and they use cellulose and acrylic cotton and create some sort of like bandage to soak up menstrual blood. And Kotex gets wind of this and they end up producing it for commercial use. And one of the really interesting things, and I love pointing this out to my students, is that typically when there's a big invention in history, somebody gets credit for having that invention. This is true of the telephone, the telegraph, electricity.
However, someone else had the idea.
Lots of other people had the idea around the same time, and one person may have had like what may have been more famous or had the better,
or
like
had
means or got the patent that, whatever. But the same is true here, and I think that could be a really interesting connection for students to make, is like understanding that typically there is sort of this like catalyst for change. And I think that it is not surprising that in 1920, the year that women get the suffrage amendment is passing and it will be ratified within the next year. So women's rights is like the topic of the time. This is also the
era that women start to take a lot of charge over their sexual reproductive health. Like there's a lot going on for women at that moment in time.
Yep.
Like I just imagine flappers, like women owning businesses for the first time, taking up different, opportunities, jobs. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, women are working outside of the home a little bit more than they were before. And so it is not surprising that all of those sort of like environmental factors led to the real need for this. Like we don't have, like women can't just do makeshift stuff anymore. And women are having less babies. Women are, you're right, they are taking control of that. Birth control, contraceptives won't be legal in every state for many decades still.
No, but there's like at that time period, there's the things that women could get access to that would help them.
Yep.
Potentially not have a child.
Yep. So Johnson & Johnson in this same year also come up with their own sort of version of this like commercially available pad. And so anybody can buy these box pads and get them, at a commercial box store in semi discretion. And I think that's there's a lot of really interesting things. Tampons also go on the market and they're applicator free, which for our non-menstruating listeners, that is very uncomfortable.
And real hard to use.
Yeah, really hard to use, and I just like pity the young person that has to deal with that because it's uncomfortable. And they're very leaky. A lot of these early products leak a lot, and obviously, like anybody who's ever watched TV, all the commercials are advertising how they don't leak and like
with blue goo.
Yeah, why is it blue? I don't know.
So there's like this big wave of advertising coming through like in the last 2 years about not using blue goo anymore.
Yeah, and like use
and it's
blood,
like
please.
Thank you, it's blood.
Yeah.
if it's so taboo still that we have to use dish detergent to describe it,
yeah,
it's a real problem that you don't support your own product's availability to the actual substance that it's needing for.
Right.
Like no, don't test it on actual blood.
Yeah,
just the blue goo.
Yeah, just the blue goo.
Sorry, sidebar. You were saying tampons.
Tampons. Oh my gosh. They invent a menstrual cup in the 30s, which is like a rubber cup that goes into the vagina and collects menstrual fluid. And this is actually, it's used more frequently now because for environmental reasons, because it's
environmental
reusable.
And longevity. You can wear them for up to 15 hours.
Yeah, yeah. And it doesn't like...
It doesn't leak and you don't have to change it.
Yeah.
So like for people who have jobs, particularly in the military, is one of them that is a heavy user of the cup.
Yeah.
Because if you're on long expeditions, you can't stop to change your pad or your tampon. You just don't have time.
Yeah.
And it's most sanitary in those environments too. Leaves no trace. It's all those kind of things.
Yeah. So this is interesting. A man named Earl Haas invents the modern tampon. It is cotton, it has an applicator, it has all of those things. And he got the idea from a female friend. And I love that in history, it's a female friend. Like, what's her freaking name? Because let's be honest,
Susan.
He wasn't like...
Karen.
Right. He wasn't like, you know what? We don't really help you out. Like, no, she was like, hey, dude. And so what she told him was she was treating her menstruation by using a sponge and, like, plugging her vagina. And this is in the 1830s. And so he invents this whole thing. And but the whole thing is, like, this is classic, like, male-dominated society where, like, he probably got the patent and, like...
Well, yeah, he was able to go forward and get it, and I imagine that she was the person that was giving him the advice on what would work or what wouldn't work.
Yeah, exactly. But I also think that that's really cool that a female friend was able to, like, talk about this with a male friend, and, like, they together were able to invent something. And she probably should have gotten more credit, let's be honest, but that's really cool.
Yeah. I'll allow it.
You'll allow it. Okay, cool.
I'm for it.
So obviously, over the next few decades, we see more and more types of tampons and pads that are better, they leak less, becoming more available. And we still see that to this day, even over the last few years, there are better products coming out. It's not until 1985 that the word period is spoken in a commercial for the first time ever. And it's done by Courtney Cox in an ad for Tampax. And I think that's crazy that it's not until, in the 60s and 70s, you see people like, you still do the and we go off to our bedroom and scene, that's
they still put their foot on the floor if any two people are laying near beds.
Right, I know. But it's not until 1985 that we can sort of insinuate sex, but we're it's still periods are not being talked about. It's not till 1985 that that's being discussed.
This is way after the female revolution too. It's of the 1970s. It's so shocking and annoying.
Yeah.
Above all else. But I imagine, so that's a TV commercial.
That was a TV commercial.
I'm hoping there's ads that talk about periods prior to that. In 1985, prior to that, you had a lot of magazines for women already published.
Yeah, yeah.
I imagine they talk about periods in those.
Yes. They I don't know, because it's so...
come on, we should probably go back and look at...
Using the word, though. I think that's the tricky thing, is, are they referring to it in some weird, your moon or whatever, and the boy said to her before.
No, Aunt Flo.
Yeah, Aunt Flo, right.
Can we just talk about the myths that you were told as a child real quick?
Sure. Why don't you tell me yours?
That if you go swimming in the ocean, that sharks can smell your menstruation.
You know what? I heard that, and to this day, every time I swim in the ocean, I'm a little bit scared. Even if I don't have my period, I'm maybe they know.
There's a lady in the water. That's the only one. There was some movie that was bears smell the menstruation.
They know. They will hunt you down. Oh my gosh, that's a good one.
But I do remember having my period for the first time, and being an athlete was a really hard thing. And I don't think that we still talk about that enough, that women are competing and what that does to their body when they have a period and they're trying to compete at top levels.
Yeah. I would really love for our listeners to look up Stacy Sims. She is a badass doctor who has written a book, and her hashtag, and you should definitely check this out, is women are not small men, because the advice given to female athletes in terms of what they should be eating, how much they should be lifting, what they should be, how much they should be sleeping, blah, 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 in terms of recovery, is all basically taking the sports science that we have for male athletes and then just being okay, so you're what, 150 pounds or whatever, whatever you weigh. So what would we recommend to a 150-pound man? That's what you should do. And she's no, women have a very unique physiology. You need to be giving them advice, sports science advice that's specific to that women's physiology. And for so long, and I don't want to name names here specifically, but there were coaches that I've interacted with in my many years of coaching at both the high school and college level in soccer and lacrosse, and winning national championships and all of those things, who were oh, you have your period, okay, take time off. And literally the science says the opposite.
My husband's a gym teacher, and he's actually, physical fitness helps with that. Whenever a girl goes into the gym and they're I have cramps. He goes, you know what helps that? Running.
Exercise. Let's go.
And poor girls. That's they thought that was the excuse to get out of gym class, or I'm having lady problems. He goes, cool, go get a tampon from the nurse and get back to class.
Yeah, exactly. Good for him. No, because it's a very serious issue, and it's that persistent stigmatization, but it's also the persistent like no knowledge, no research being done into women's health, and that's problematic. And Stacy Sims is really awesome. She has this book Roar that I've been reading, and it's a really great book that I want to recommend to everybody if you're interested in the science behind that, because what she does is she gets into like the types of things that you need to be eating at different stages in your cycle.
Yep.
And what would help you at different phases. She recommends like weightlifting, especially during your period, and because it's a really good time to be building.
Right.
She also talks about how at different points in your cycle, you are actually at this, like basically your hormones become very similar to male hormones. And so what's hilarious about the stigma is just that at points you are very male, and oftentimes those are the points where people are like, oh, you're being moody, and it's like, no. I'm just like not taking this, I'm not being like compliant and all the things that you expect of me on when I'm, when my hormones are different or whatever it is.
Fascinating.
So it's very fascinating. I would say for somebody like your husband who works with female athletes regularly, that would be an awesome book to read so that you can better push them to their potential rather than giving them super outdated advice that is not accurate. And I'm sure there are some women that are listening here being like, oh, but I have really bad cramps and blah, blah, blah. And maybe that's actually true, but there are certainly things that could be causing that might be worth looking into if you haven't already. And the other thing is, you never know, if you start paying attention to this science that Sims and other doctors are pushing out, you might find that if you treat your body better building up to your period,
it may be different.
Yeah, it may be a bit different. And I shouldn't say better, I just mean appropriately,
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, is it's not about being hard on your body, like go run, but it's about like, no, you can
understanding your body more.
Understanding how it works.
So when you think about this entire topic and bringing it into a classroom.
Yeah.
Get me there.
So I think what's really important is it is an interesting scientific question. I could see this topic being addressed. I mean, I do think it would be addressed well in a health class. Like maybe outside of a history class would be a good place to talk about the history of this.
Also, stop separating boys and girls in health classes.
Yeah, boys should learn about this too. And boys should learn about this for, the reason that you described, which is what if someday like you have to give advice to a friend, but also I think there's something about empathy building. And sorry, not a friend, a child, like what if you're a dad?
Also just knowing about the species that you are a part of.
Yeah.
You're humans.
Yeah.
We're all humans.
Everyone
should learn about each other's bodies.
Yeah, and how they work and the things that you're dealing with. And I think that's really powerful. In a history class, I could see this being something that's touched on in terms of as these patents, like we talk about the invention of the light bulb and all of these other things that are revolutionary.
Yep.
And this facilitates women's life in the workforce.
Yep.
So that is revolutionary and it's transformative. And I think that would, like if we can give some other products, really, that's all they are, business ventures, if we can give them airtime in a history class.
Then why not?
Why not do this? Especially if you're doing a unit on women's rights. And, when you end the suffrage unit, you then probably go into all the things that happened once women had the vote. And the number of states that began legalizing contraceptives and all the things related to that. And this would just tie really nicely into that topic as a passing mention. I also think in a world history class, it's really hard to ignore what people believed about women in those Middle Ages. And I think that it would be a really cool way to teach about the different ways that women are treated in different cultures by just saying, okay, so when it comes to their periods, how did this culture treat women? And you could take things, I mean, we read passages from Muhammad, from Judaism, and you could take those very passages, and there are more, and just say, okay, in this religion, how did they talk about that? And I think that would be really a powerful thing for students to see. And I really like, Brooke, your question that you asked tonight about, well, could this be empowering? You know, she's hanging out in her hut and she's getting privacy and she's getting whatever. And I think that would be a really great question for young girls to ask. What would you do in your hut for a week?
Okay, so your courses come on.
Yeah.
You get the vapors.
Yeah.
Where do you take them and how do you take your leave?
Yeah. And of course, there's the deprivation of food and other things, but I think that would be a worthy thing for girls to think about. Like, oh my God, that's what people used to think about my sex. And, you know, I think having that historical context, at least for me, makes me feel like, you know what? I am going to talk about my period. And when I buy my tampons or my pads or whatever I'm buying, I'm not going to be shy about it. And I'm going to ask my husband to buy them, because if there's shame in that I have to bear, he needs to bear it with me, you know? And like, I think that that's okay.
Well, and I think being moms of boys, there's a level of responsibility we have to educating our own sons about periods and what happens there, because they're going to interact with women.
Yeah.
And that's just how it's going to be.
Yeah.
So they need to be aware of what impacts women's lives.
Yeah. And they need to know that, like, that, you know, I know a lot of people who grew up in homes where, you know, when mom or sister or whatever was on their period, it was like, whoa, watch out, you know? And it's like, God, that is such an awful leftover stigma from all of, like, that. When you say that, watch out, I want you to think about the hut. And I want you to think about women being deprived of their family and their spouse and food and freedom. What are you saying when you say watch out? Like, what does that actually mean to you?
Or how about instead of that, like, do you want salt or chocolate?
Yeah.
Like, would you like to go for a run?
How can we teach people to be more empathetic, more understanding,
kind,
more supportive of one another? Yeah.
That's good. Kelsey, this is good.
Brooke, you're good.
I'm Brooke Sullivan.
I'm Kelsey Eckert.
See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.